A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this spectre. With these words, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels begin their Communist Manifesto of 1848. Slaveholders and slaves, serfs and landlords, capitalists and workers, human society has been divided into classes for millennia. Equally as old are the longing and striving for a world without exploitation and oppression, and the existence of revolutionary struggles.
Marx and Engels developed socialism from a utopia, wishful thinking, into a science. They substantiated the world historical role of the working class, which can overthrow capitalism in the proletarian revolution and build a socialist society. The communist program scares the ruling powers. Their accusation, Marx and Engels want
the abolition of personally acquired, self-earned property, abolition of the personality and of the freedom of family.
The two answer.
In your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. You reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so, that is just what we intend.
The Communist Manifesto quickly spread. It became one of the most widely read books in the world and helps to change it through revolution. The spectre of communism remains for the rulers around the globe a nightmare. They cannot escape it.
In late 2008, the deepest, most comprehensive and longest-lasting world economic and financial crisis in history of capitalism erupted. Wars and uprising movements unsettle whole world regions. A global environmental crisis threatens the basis of humanity's existence. Worldwide, a trend to the left is developing among the masses. A new world historical situation has emerged, harboring the potential for a revolutionary world crisis. Imperialism, with its all-around crisis-proneness, can hardly convince anybody anymore today. On the contrary, the material prerequisites for socialism are more developed than ever today. The technical and scientific possibilities could be the basis of globally united socialist states and a communist social system. However, to nevertheless justify imperialist exploitation and oppression and the insane overexploitation of nature, socialism is demonized even more vehemently and cunningly.
Deeply worried that the reputation of socialism has not been permanently undermined despite all previous smear campaigns, in 2006 the Council of Europe adopted an anti-communist policy statement. They want to get rid of the spectre of communism once and for all, therefore they resolved.
The real cause of international terrorism is communism.
This resolution about
the need for international condemnation of crimes of totalitarian communist regimes
is based on the notorious
Black Book of Communism
of a certain Stéphane Courtois. This is a commissioned pamphlet containing atrocity stories about the formerly socialist Soviet Union and Mao Zedong's China. Even the victims of the resistance war of the Socialist Soviet Union against Hitlerlite fascism are declared victims of socialism. However, this red-baiting exercise involving the wild juggling of figures is so flat and dull that it is even criticized by serious-minded bourgeois scientists as insupportable.
The mass media, however, ignore this critique. They cannot base their war against socialism on facts and arguments. They only have the possibility to influence the masses with anti-communist prejudices and systematically fueled fears. With a mixture of lies, half-truths and truths, by taking up progressive opinions, feelings and experiences, they can achieve this manipulation more effectively than through openly reactionary anti-communism.
The party program of the MLPD characterizes modern anti-communism.
Modern anti-communism hypocritically adjusts itself to the spirit of the age, adopts a critical standpoint towards capitalist society, and denigrates socialism at the same time.
In the center of the attacks of modern anti-communism in Germany is the MLPD.
The MLPD is attacked by the ruling class because the party proudly carries Marx and Lenin in its name and in its theoretical work creatively extends their fundamental teachings to all pressing questions of our time. The MLPD is fought because, as a new type of Marxist-Leninist party, it does not put down the torch of the freedom ideology of communism for even a moment. Because the MLPD, as a revolutionary workers' party, stands for the liberation from exploitation of humans by humans, they try to pretend the party doesn't exist. Because it is not satisfied with women's equality on paper, but champions women's liberation in a liberated society, open or subtle efforts are undertaken to marginalize and defame the MLPD. Because, as a party of proletarian internationalism, it is committed to the liberation struggle of the oppressed peoples and nations against imperialism, the MLPD is labeled as an alleged abettor of international terrorism and suppressed. The MLPD is denigrated because it advocates a social system in which humans live in unity with nature and do not compromise the existence of coming generations by unbridled overexploitation. It is a method of modern anti-communism to maintain silence about the MLPD and its party line in order to make a downright wall of fears and prejudices of a petty bourgeois anti-communist mode of thinking take undisturbed effect among the masses. They dare not let representatives of the MLPD speak in the mass media. Deliberately, it is not mentioned that important demands of the working class movement, the women's movement or the anti-fascist mass movement have been championed by the MLPD for decades and often were introduced by the party. This applies, for example, to the demand for the 30-hour work week with no loss of pay, which also has been put on the agenda now by progressive scientists and militant trade unionists. This is also the case for the nowadays widespread demand for the banning of all fascist organizations and their propaganda. But in the international trend to the left, more and more the masses think for themselves. Modern anti-communism loses its effect. A system that only produces crisis and stuns or suppresses any sustainable progress cannot justify itself in the long run. Everywhere in the world struggles flare up, new revolutionary parties and militant movements emerge. The openness for genuine socialism especially grows where Marxist-Leninists are involved.
Uprising movements must not come to a dead end and possibly be instrumentalized by reactionary forces. Therefore, revolutionary forces worldwide need to unite. In October 2010, more than 40 revolutionary organizations and parties from 5 continents founded the I-Corps, the International Coordination of Revolutionary Parties and Organizations. About the purpose of the new organization, Stefan Engel, chairman of the MLPD, said at the founding festivities:
Die Zeit ist heute reif,
The time is ripe today to take a significant step forward to a permanently organized cooperation of the revolutionary international working class movement. That revolutionary forces, revolutionary uprisings and heroic liberation movements can be suppressed due to their national isolation, lack of international solidarity, and an international counter-revolution must not be allowed to happen again.
What actually is the history of anti-communism? What conceptions and whose interests does it represent?
From the beginning, anti-communism was connected with defamation, persecution, repression, including murder and slaughter. It is the ideology of unfreedom, of bitter hostility towards the working class movement and the societal progress of humanity. The struggle against anti-communism is therefore the lifeblood of any revolutionary work. It is a hard political struggle against political discrimination and repression. It is especially an ideological struggle to free oneself from the shackles of bourgeois society. Already Karl Marx was denigrated and persecuted. First being expelled from Germany, then from France and Belgium, he lived since 1849 in English exile, temporarily in poorest conditions. Together with his closest friend and comrade Friedrich Engels, he developed the basic principles of Marxism. Marxism's triumph in the young working class movement required militant, hard struggle, but could not be stopped.
In Germany, the Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck took action with the Anti-Socialist Laws against the public danger of social democratic endeavors. But the SPD, being at this time still revolutionary, did not let itself be intimidated and did imaginative, illegal rank-and-file work.
When the anti-socialist laws had to be lifted in 1890, the SPD had grown into a party of the masses. Bismarck's anti-communist offensive had failed. At the beginning of the 20th century, the idea of communism became, for the first time, a material force. During the devastating First World War, a historical turning point began with the October Revolution of 1917 in Russia. The ruling forces in the capitalist countries were appalled by this alleged coup. But the workers all over the world were enthused about the first successful proletarian revolution under the leadership of the Bolshevik Party founded by Lenin. Their victory was an incentive and encouragement for the masses in Europe who rose up against war and starvation. There were revolutionary struggles in many countries, but they were drowned in blood, like the German Revolution in November 1918. Its leaders Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were brutally murdered in the name of anti-communism. Anti-communism does not shy away from any crime and terror, regardless of the cost. In the view of anti-communism, the freedom to exploit other people justifies everything.
Lenin always advocated the strategy of the international revolution. After the bloody suppression of the revolutionary movements in the other European countries, he took up the challenge to start building socialism in only one country with a perspective of the international socialist revolution. This successful building of the first socialist country in the world, despite brutal, massive and years-long military intervention by capitalist countries, is still today a declaration of war of the international revolutionary working class movement against imperialism.
Initially, the young Soviet Union had to deal, by means of the dictatorship of the proletariat, especially with the domestic followers of the overthrown classes. They did not shy away from any crime to sabotage, the construction of socialism and turn back the wheel of history. At the same time, socialism developed broadest democracy for the working people. The workers held power in the state. In the factories, the workers decided about production and working conditions through their trade union and party organizations on the basis of plans for the whole of society. In capitalism, unthinkable. The liberation from the shackles of capitalism enabled breathtaking progress in industry and agriculture and in the overall life of the masses. From the backward agrarian country Russia, the modern industrial state Soviet Union emerged. Millions learned to read and write by creating societal conditions of communal life like nutrition, housing, education and medicine, and introducing groundbreaking rights. The conditions were created for the liberation of women from centuries-long oppression.
The initiative of artists and filmmakers, scientists and engineers enthused progressive people all around the world. The construction of socialism became a success story.
In 1924, Lenin died at the age of just 53. Joseph Stalin took over the leadership of the party and state and continued Lenin's successful policies.
Especially this makes him a hate figure of anti-communists around the globe.
While the socialist Soviet Union made headway, the capitalist world tumbled from 1929 till 1932 into a deep world economic crisis. Dreading further socialist countries, the big industrial and armament monopolies relied on sheer terror against the revolutionary workers' movement. In Italy, Spain, Japan and Germany, fascist regimes emerged. In Germany, Hitler was heaved into power by the ruling monopolies for the chief purpose of wiping out socialism and communism internationally. With a vicious concoction of anti-Semitism and anti-communism, in his book Mein Kampf, Hitler sought to whip up a campaign against the alleged Jewish Bolshevik world conspiracy. From day one of the fascist dictatorship, the war against the Soviet Union was prepared. Murder, torture and concentration camps for tens of thousands of communists and other progressives, and finally the attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941 show anti-communism in its historically most aggressive form.
Against all interior and exterior adversaries, Stalin was able to defend the bulwark of the international working class and socialism. But the danger of war emanating from the fascists increased. The Western imperialists literally waited for fascist Germany to liquidate the Soviet Union. All offers from Stalin to Britain, France and the USA for joint action against fascism were strictly rejected by the governments.
Stalin foiled this policy of acquiescing to Hitler's aggression. With a masterstroke, he agreed in 1939 to a non-aggression pact with Hitler's Germany. The Soviet Union thus won vital and valuable time to prepare itself for the fascist aggression. The bourgeois historians rant about a Hitler-Stalin pact. As a matter of fact, the non-aggression pact was a condition for the victory over Hitlerlite fascism. This is unequivocally shown by the course of the Second World War. There can hardly be a grosser falsification of history than the claim of modern anti-communism that in the Second World War two equally criminal tyrants clashed. It was the Hitlerite army which assaulted the socialist Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. It was the socialist consciousness of the masses in the Soviet Union who made huge sacrifices that forced Hitlerite fascism with its superior weapons technology to its knees.
Only after massive pressure from the workers' movements, especially in Britain and the USA, was the anti-fascist, anti-Hitler coalition formed by the Soviet Union, the USA, France and Britain. Socialism emerged, strengthened from the war, as the masses drew their conclusions. In East Germany and Eastern Europe, people's democracies emerged and started on their way to socialism. When in 1949, also in China, the new democratic revolution was victorious, a third of humanity had been freed from capitalist exploitation and oppression.
This socialist camp also strengthened communist parties in imperialist countries. But this was not at all the war objective of imperialism. The ruling elite in the Western countries was alarmed. During the war, an Uncle Joe movement comprising 1 million people emerged in the USA. Uncle Joe referred to Joseph Stalin. The movement demanded more efforts of the USA to support the Soviet Union in the fight against Hitlerlite fascism. The magazine Time honored Stalin together with Churchill and Roosevelt as Men of the Year. After the end of the war, the contradiction between capitalism and socialism again came to the fore. The USA changed its tactics and a fanatical hunt for communists started in the McCarthy era. The so-called Cold War began. Famous artists and scientists like Humphrey Bogart, Charlie Chaplin, Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer were attacked. Thomas Mann, the world-renowned German writer who fled from Hitlerite fascists to the USA, was put under the proscription of anti-communism for being one of the world's most important defenders of Stalin and his followers.
West Germany became a frontline state and anti-communism the state religion of new German imperialism. The Christian Democrat Chancellor Adenauer distinguished himself as master of anti-communist demagoguery. He painted a picture of a red danger from the Socialist Soviet Union or a yellow danger from revolutionary China. With that, he justified the split of Germany, the rearmament and the accession of West Germany to the imperialist military alliance NATO.
On May 17, 1956, the KPD, the Communist Party of Germany, with its nearly 400,000 members was banned. Its youth league FDJ, the Free German Youth, already was banned in 1951. The FDJ had been especially committed to the fight against remilitarization. This aggressive anti-communism did not even spare anti-fascists who had just escaped from the concentration camps. They were again arrested and lost their rights as persecutors of the Nazi regime. For their upstandingness, they were treated like dangerous criminals.
250,000 communists were brought to court, 2,000 prison sentences imposed, 60,000 private dispositions enforced, tens of thousands expelled from the trade unions.
In Eastern Germany, the masses carved out hopeful beginnings of socialist construction. Today, the GDR is flatly defamed in the media as socialist state of injustice. Socialism supposedly was foredoomed to be an economy of scarcity due to the lack of competition. As proof, the fall of the GDR in 1989 is cited.
But what was proffered in the GDR since the end of the 1950s as real socialism had long ceased to be socialism. In all former socialist countries, capitalism was restored. What had happened?
What was not achieved by anti-communist attacks from the outside was induced by changes in the interior of the formerly socialist countries. Socialism was betrayed. The turning point was the 20th Party Congress of the CPSU in 1956. Already before, a stratum of petty bourgeois bureaucrats gradually had spread in party and state. 3 years after Stalin's demise, they seized power at this Party Congress. As these holders of power aimed for reconciliation with capitalism, they gradually revised and falsified Marxism-Leninism. Distorting it into empty phrases, they continued to use it in words for disguise. Proletarian revolutions were to be renounced in favor of an allegedly peaceful road to socialism. This makes a mockery of the entire history of the working class movement, yet this illusion was spread by revisionist parties. In Indonesia and Chile, hundreds of thousands, even millions of communists and progressive people had to pay for this with their lives in bloody massacres.
Secondly, the modern revisionists hold that the dictatorship of the proletariat is superfluous and the state morphs wondrously into a state of the whole people. Marx and Engels always pointed out that socialism is a transitional society to a classless communist society.
Only in a classless society can the state be relinquished step by step as an instrument of power against the old powers.
In a letter to August Bebel in 1875, Friedrich Engels wrote unmistakably,
"Now, since the state is merely a transitional institution of which use is made in the struggle, in the revolution to keep down one's enemies by force, it is utter nonsense to speak of a free people state. So long as the proletariat still makes use of the state, it makes use of it not for the purpose of freedom, but of keeping down its enemies, and, as soon as there can be any question of freedom, the state as such ceases to exist."
Thirdly, the modern revisionists hold that communists ought to promote material incentives among the masses instead of selfless commitment to the community. Material incentives organize personal advantage and want to promote personal gain, so that socialist consciousness can be subverted.
Material incentives is a policy designed to destroy a solidarity-based society. It promotes competition and self-interest. This is the mode of thinking which dominated the degenerated petty bourgeois bureaucrats, who staged a coup to gain power and thus secure control. But the high renown enjoyed by Joseph Stalin among the masses was an obstacle to this restoration of capitalism. Publicly, Khrushchev and his pals did not yet dare to attack him. The 20th Party Congress was officially nearly finished when Khrushchev took the delegates by surprise with a defamatory speech about Stalin, the so-called secret speech.
The co-founder and leading thinker of the MLPD, Willy Dickhut, stated that
Khrushchev, in an outrageous speech, labeled Stalin's great struggle against the enemies of the working class and of socialism, against the infamous activities of the bureaucracy, as nothing but persecution, arbitrariness, misuse of power, brutal oppression and physical liquidation of innocent people. He branded Stalin a criminal.
That major parts of the secret speech are direct fabrications has long been proven, even by bourgeois historians.
Bourgeois anti-communists all over the world cheered Khrushchev. What was before only propagated by enemies of the Soviet Union and socialism, especially by the propaganda machine of Hitlerlite fascism or the Trotskyists under the battle cry of Stalinism, was now the official party line of the CPSU. Socialism suffered a devastating defeat. As a result, tremendous confusion prevailed and splits in the international working class movement became rampant. Particularly also because Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Ulbricht and Honecker continued to claim for decades to be communists and bandied about hackneyed phrases. A dictatorship of a new bureaucratic bourgeoisie developed in the leadership of party, economy and state. In all formerly socialist countries, capitalism was restored step by step in the form of bureaucratic state monopoly capitalism. The Soviet Union became a social imperialist superpower. Socialist in words, imperialist in deeds. The unfolding Cold War was not between capitalism and socialism, but rather a new inter-imperialist rivalry. The new rulers in the Kremlin declared their world power aspirations. The rulers in the Western imperialist countries exploited with relish what developed in so-called real socialism: careerism, cronyism, selfishness, privileges for the party and state leadership and their families, supply shortages, domineering, and lacking freedom of travel for the masses.
With deep mistrust, Honecker and his pals observed the growing discontent among their own populace, and especially leftist critics. The Ministry of State Security changed its character. Instead of targeting enemies of socialism, now the whole populace was spied on, to protect the restoration of capitalism against any criticism.
In 1968, the Soviet Union attacked Czechoslovakia, and in 1979, Afghanistan. These and other crimes of the social imperialist Soviet Union are presented in the West as typically Stalinist. Only as a reminder, Stalin had already been dead for decades at this time. But in their smear campaigns against him, Western imperialists and modern revisionists are fully united. Those who continue to hold Stalin in esteem are ostracized as Stalinists. Really everybody? Or just the MLPD?
Pablo Picasso possibly is the most famous painter of the 20th century. Not only did he declare, "I am a communist and my painting is communist painting," he remained faithful to this line until the end of his life and published on Stalin's death the distinctive but simple portrait on the front page of the Humanité, the newspaper of the French Communist Party. Probably the most ingenious physicist of the 20th century, Albert Einstein, declared about the threat of war,
"I am convinced there is only one way to eliminate these grave evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy."
The Nobel Literature Prize laureate George Bernard Shaw stated,
"I have repeatedly emphasized that civilization is only possible on the basis of communism."
Poets and authors like Bertolt Brecht, Leon Feuchtwanger, Oskar Maria Graf, all Stalinists? And finally, Charlie Chaplin. What label could be put on him, who declared,
"Although I am not a communist, I refuse to fall in line by hating them."
By all available means, anti-communism tries to prevent such democratic views, or even respect for communists and their worldview. But this meets with opposition.
In the 1960s, new impulses for the international Marxist-Leninist and working-class movement came from China. Mao Zedong and the Communist Party of China subjected the course of the 20th Party Congress and Moscow's politics to a severe, principled critique. On this basis, new Marxist-Leninist parties were founded in many countries. Enthusiasm for Mao Zedong's China and the Cultural Revolution spread among the youth of the world. In Germany, the metalworker and experienced communist Willy Dickhut started at the age of 65 to rebuild a revolutionary party. He became a pioneer and role model of the MLPD. In 1972, the book The Restoration of Capitalism in the Soviet Union was published, which uncovers the deeper causes for the betrayal of socialism and also attracted considerable international attention. Especially to young revolutionaries, the events of the 1960s in China appear as a practical, inspirational critique of the dull picture presented by the Soviet Union and the GDR. In the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, the broad masses were mobilized against the threat of a takeover by a degenerated bureaucracy. In wallpapers, in public criticism meetings, the Chinese, first youths and students, then also workers and farmers, turned against the capitalist rulers in power a la Deng Xiaoping. They were not going to allow these forces to pry the achievements of socialism out of their hands.
This revolution touching the soul inspired the young all over the world. Even the Spiegel, a German bourgeois magazine, wrote at the beginning of 1971,
"Today, 4 years after the outbreak of the alleged cultural outrage, China is the only socialist country without foreign debts. Its foreign trade currency is one of the most stable in the world. It seems to have succeeded in diverting the released energies into a gigantic technical, economic revolution, embracing the whole populace."
You no longer can read anything like this today. Maoism has become, after Stalinism, the central fighting word of modern anti-communism.
The manipulation of opinion acts like a scissors in the head. Actually, one knows nothing about either person, their lives and works in their time. Nevertheless, seemingly everyone somehow knows that they must have been frightening figures with whom one should not further concern oneself. In China, too, capitalism was restored after the death of Mao Zedong, and nowadays the country belongs to the most aggressive imperialist countries of the world.
The partly barbaric conditions for the working class and the masses of the farmers in China do not upset the anti-communist ideologists. They are only interested in how they can blame Mao Zedong even for this. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989-1990, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the integration of the GDR into the Federal Republic of Germany, and the capitalist development in China, the ruling circles euphorically rejoiced about the death of socialism, or even the end of history.
But they are wrong, and promptly they get the blues. Worldwide mass struggles again are connected more strongly with socialist ideas. New Marxist-Leninist organizations get established, existing ones are strengthened. In Europe, surveys show again and again that the majority of the population is persistently of the opinion that socialism is a good idea, but has only been badly implemented so far. The classics of Marxism-Leninism are carried along in the mass protests in many countries. Flexibilized working hours, permanent stress, workplace bullying, unemployment and Hartz IV, paternalistic authorities, the constraints of capitalism strengthen each day the wish of the workers for liberty and social security. This cannot be negated by modern anti-communism. It takes this issue up in such a way as if in capitalism at least personal freedom is possible, despite all deficiencies, whereas in socialism there would be unfreedom and terror. Allegedly everybody here has a free choice of occupation. Everybody can climb the social ladder if they only want to. Germany has 2.2 million students, more young people than ever before. They do not appear in any unemployment statistics, but only every third, at most, will get a job, provided they don't drop out before then.
The situation of the young workers is much worse. After successful training, many end up without permanent jobs, serving as cheap labor with temporary employment agencies. In the EU, meanwhile, almost every third of the 24 million young persons between the ages of 15 and 24, 7.5 million, has no job.
This is the reality of the free choice of occupation on the capitalist job market. We hear nothing more about freedom and human rights when strikes and mass demonstrations are violently suppressed, when surveillance and spying is omnipresent. In the name of the freedom of the individual, the 500 biggest international supermonopolies, from banking, manufacturing, trade and agriculture, control almost the entire world economy. They dominate international organizations like the United Nations, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization or International Labour Organization. They meddle with politics in all countries worldwide and shape the system of neocolonialism. 1,250 million people worldwide are unemployed, millions flee from wars and environmental catastrophes, billions have to survive on less than $1 a day. How free are all those people in their decisions?
The communists, of all people, who carry forward the torch of humanity's struggle for freedom, are accused by the defenders of these conditions of wanting to abolish freedom. In 2012, the MLPD proudly celebrated its 30th birthday. From the hodgepodge of over 150 K-groups, which emerged from the students' movement in 1968, the MLPD developed and stabilized as the only revolutionary workers' organization in Germany.
Today, the MLPD and its Youth League Rebel are represented in more than 450 cities and regions in all the German states. It is a genuine workers' party with a membership of almost 75% of workers and low-level white-collar employees. The share of women's membership is 43%. Its members are independently thinking and acting people. Intensive theoretical work created the foundation for this. The principal analyses and conclusions are assembled in the now 35 editions of the theoretical organ Revolutionärer Weg. But the party also has powerful enemies. Cologne Chorweiler. Headquarters of the Verfassungsschutz, the Domestic Intelligence Service. This most infamous of German institutions is the most important supplier of keywords for modern anti-communism in Germany. The top personnel of the fascist Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, was divided up in West Germany at the end of the Second World War. One part moved on to the CIA, another part to the British Intelligence Service, while another part found new responsibilities with the new German intelligence agencies. More than just a few agents of the East German Stasi also joined the Verfassungsschutz after the demise of the GDR, a truly illustrious body. One of the official assignments and justifications for this intelligence agency is the monitoring of neo-fascist groups. How effectively this is done with the aid of many informers is proven in many ways by the scandal involving the neo-fascist killers of the NSU gang and their links to the neo-Nazi party NPD. The result of the agency's observation of leftist organizations used to slander them automatically are distributed in the agency's yearly report to all editors of newspapers, radio and TV stations, to authorities, schools and universities, and to the millions of civil servants. Treated as a reliable source of information, these reports provide communication guidelines on how to deal with the leftist danger. A central method of modern anti-communism is arbitrary historical analogies. Following this simple but doubtful pattern, if-then, it is claimed, if there were crimes at the time in socialism, then those who advocate socialism today must consider those crimes right and will perpetrate similar crimes once they obtain the power to do so.
By applying the same logic, every member of the Christian churches nowadays would have to be denounced, because in the medieval ages, crusades were initiated in the name of Christianity, and later witches were burned. Also, every SPD member could be denounced applying this method, as in 1919, the then SPD leadership was partly responsible for the killings of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Also, during the suppression of the revolutionary movement of the Red Ruhr Army in 1920, SPD politicians tainted themselves with the blood of 2,000 murdered Red Guards. Of course, it is absurd to blame Christian or Social Democrat workers for this today.
However, for communists, it is supposedly different. They are not given credit for the world historical advances, but blamed solely for the failures and faults occurring during the building of socialism. No communist will deny that the Soviet Union, built without historical model, born from the misery of years-long suffering from war and most brutal Tsarist oppression, hampered by rampant illiteracy and economic backwardness, also made errors. Yes, there were also crimes against humanity committed by degenerated party bureaucrats. However, these problems did not originate from socialism, but from the influence of bourgeois ideology, not yet overcome in society, which especially was reflected in a petty bourgeois bureaucratic mode of thinking. We know today that Stalin underestimated this ideological problem. We also know that the masses were insufficiently mobilized by Stalin in the struggle against petty bourgeois bureaucrats and carrierists, who quite often acted as devious denouncers and did not shy away from crimes. However, that does not mean that the socialist system was criminal. The Soviet Union under Stalin's leadership rightly was the glowing example of the international revolutionary and working class movement. The MLPD steps up to defend and continue the socialist achievements. In the process, the party will also learn from the mistakes and avoid them in a future socialist society.
A classic example of anti-communist defamation is the accusation of personality cult raised against MLPD chairman Stefan Engel. With no real proof, mind you, only with dubious allusions that there was also a personality cult around Stalin or Mao Zedong. Their evidence? Since 1979, Stefan Engel has been elected by all party congresses to the Central Committee in a secret vote and then made chairman by the Central Committee. As chairman, roughly twice a year, he gives an interview in the party newspaper Rote Fahne. According to the logic of the intelligence service, this really proves everything. When it comes to the non-stop media presence of bourgeois politicians or the infallible Pope, they speak of continuity or success, but surely not personality cult.
But the protectors of the Constitution upped the ante, and in the lawsuit brought by the MLPD against their defamations, presented the court a new, breathtaking chain of evidence about the personality cult around and from Stefan Engel. He sometimes writes poems, and some were printed in the Rote Fahne. What does this have to do with a personality cult reminiscent of Mao Zedong? Mao too wrote poems. Any more questions? Even for the court, which otherwise metes out vile class justice, this went too far. The passage in the book had to be blackened, along with a claim of purges within the MLPD. The whole thing was so embarrassing that publisher Schöning dropped the book from its program. Nevertheless, calling the MLPD a sect and other effronteries were judged by the court to be an acceptable freedom of expression. The MLPD, of course, will not stand for this. In its efforts to get to the bottom of the causes of misguided developments in socialism and to prevent their reoccurrence, the MLPD has developed the doctrine of the mode of thinking. It proves how originally upright revolutionaries and anti-fascists, such as most of the leaders of the SED, including Ulbricht and Honecker once were, became card-carrying party people in power who, full of self-interest and the conceit of power, left the socialist path and became a new bourgeoisie. Independent thinking and acting of all comrades is the decisive factor for the success of the MLPD. Hardly any other party or organization places so much emphasis on the training of its members and on criticism and self-criticism, on the permanent analysis of the economic and political developments, and the improvement of one's own work.
In Germany, so-called Schmähkritik or abusive criticism is legally forbidden. Carriers of modern anti-communism against the MLPD are often old left has-beens. There are a number of such dubious types, especially in the ranks of the Greens and the SPD, such as Ulla Schmidt, Berthold Huber, Jürgen Trittin, Joschka Fischer and others.
They were active in the 1970s in the so-called K-groups and dreamed of a revolution, preferably here and now. This was not possible, so their petit bourgeois mode of thinking impelled them to make a march through the institutions. They were able to rise up to hold government offices, sacrificing their ideals for a warm spot in the lap of the bourgeoisie. A special role in the concert of modern anti-communism is played by the modern revisionist of the party The Left and the German Communist Party DKP. The latter party got its legal accreditation in 1968 through a shady deal. It had to remove deserved and well-known figures from its leadership, had to pledge allegiance to the constitution, including the protection of private ownership of the means of production, and had to forsake the goal of the dictatorship of the proletariat in its program and renounce the socialist revolution. And that it did. The prohibition of the KPD and all successor organizations, however, remains untouched to this day. It is applied nowadays especially against the MLPD, for example, in the form of incompatibility rulings denying membership in the Metal Workers' Union or free access to the mass media.
Gregor Gysi, media star of the party The Left, repeatedly has declared he would rather collaborate with the liberal FDP than with the MLPD, and being loyal to the constitution, he cites reliable sources, the slanders of the domestic intelligence service. In hopes of gaining government participation at the side of the SPD, the leadership of the party The Left distances itself more and more from progressive militant positions.
Especially the illusion of a peaceful road to socialism, the defamation of revolutionary force against the brutal resistance of the powerful, is advocated as basic line by leading representatives of the DKP and the Left Party. This meets with more and more opposition also from members of the DKP and the Left Party. If capitalism and imperialism could be tamed so easily through elections and reforms, then one has to ask why for 150 years millions of revolutionaries all over the world have put their entire lives into the balance pen of life, as Rosa Luxemburg once said, for the preparation and realization of the revolution, for the selfless construction and defense of a socialist society. Many people rightly despise opportunism, ingratiation and careerism. They want to know how the MLPD intends to prevent its functionaries from degenerating in the same way once they are in power. A continuously developed system of self-control and control within the party is the convincing answer.
The MLPD and its youth league, Rebel, present themselves as radically left, revolutionary and for genuine socialism, and are becoming increasingly attractive for people who search for alternatives to the lack of prospects in this capitalist societal system.
The MLPD is a revolutionary workers' party, party of the youth, of women's liberation, of proletarian internationalism, of radical environmental protection, of the struggle for peace, of determined anti-fascist struggle and the struggle for democratic rights and liberties. It is the party of the liberation of all those exploited and oppressed by imperialism. Those who directly experience the daily rank-and-file work of the MLPD in factories, trade unions, self-run organizations or neighborhoods thus know the party's work and can judge it, and surely can only wonder about the slanders. But against the system of the petty bourgeois mode of thinking and the petty bourgeois anti-communist mode of thinking, practical experiences are not sufficient. Many people back away from positioning themselves openly against modern anti-communism because they are inhibited by the feeling that there might be a point to the mantra-like repetition of the allegations.
Subtle fears of being misused or prejudices are mobilized. Accordingly, it might be better, for example, if no parties at all participate in action alliances. In reality, such exclusions are mostly only targeted at the MLPD.
The MLPD is accused of dominating by the self-proclaimed leaders of the particular movement. However, they themselves blatantly represent the positions of SPD, the Greens or the party the left and pull the strings. The MLPD is adamant about acting openly and allowing everybody an independent judgment. Everybody should be able to get their own picture of the standpoints of different currents and parties in theory and practice. The opponents of socialism know, in open dispute, they are clearly inferior. Thus, they avoid it like the plague. The MLPD does not need to fear an open dispute. Quite the opposite. Because there is not a jot of truth in the rumors, reservations and defamations of modern anti-communism, we strive for an open debate, for free controversy, in which we self-confidently take the offensive.
We know, those who want to fight for freedom need to free themselves from anti-communist fears and reservations. They will then recognize that the MLPD is being attacked because it has answers to the burning questions of today.
The more the crisis of capitalism becomes visible and the MLPD gains ground, the more modern anti-communism will rant and rave, but its effect will also wear off. The open polarization also helps the masses to see more clearly who is friend or foe. Whoever wants to gain their own insights into the MLPD should study its program and get to know the party thoroughly in theory and practice, preferably in close collaboration.
A new anti-communism movement is emerging also in Germany, in a broad societal spectrum. In Bavaria, thousands of signees from 84 organizations support a protest declaration to the Bavarian Interior Ministry for the immediate deactivation of the website Bavaria Against Left-Wing Extremism. 95 non-profit organizations oppose in an open letter a plan to deny non-profit status and therefore tax advantages to organizations declared as extremist by the German Domestic Intelligence Agency. It is time to honor Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin and Mao Zedong for their merits in the struggle for the liberation of humanity from exploitation and oppression, to understand their practical work, to delve in detail into their writings and conclusions, to draw lessons for the present and future struggle.
Our series Evenings of the Classics, with meetings and films, will devote itself to this. Evening by evening, we will gain well-founded knowledge, strong arguments, strong feelings and a growing assurance in the offensive for genuine socialism and against modern anti-communism. Every one of these classics of Marxism-Leninism stood in the focal point of the respect and veneration of revolutionaries and broad masses, but also in the crosshairs of anti-communism. By placing trust in the masses, they all achieved successes that will not be forgotten. Give anti-communism no chance.